Welcome to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. It's a podcast that amplifies the voices of people with multiple chemical sensitivity, or MCS, also known as environmental illness, chemical intolerance, and toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, or TILT. The podcast also highlights emerging research about the illness. This episode features a conversation with two women with severe MCS who've had to make difficult decisions to live in their vehicles because synthetic and scented chemicals that many people use make them ill. Maggie chose to use a pseudonym for our conversation, and Evangeline Elmendorf Greene are both based in Arizona, a state in the west of the United States. They know one another but haven't met in person. Maggie has lived in vehicles for over 4 years, in an SUV, a van, and now they live in a compact car. Evangeline is starting her 5th year living in a number of different vehicles and currently lives in a Nissan camper van. Both women seek out places in the countryside and wilderness where there are less synthetic chemicals and fragrance products than in populated areas. Maggie parks on what's known as free land owned by the Bureau of Land Management, sometimes traveling to nearby states when the air is affected by forest fire smoke. Evangeline rents camping spots on people's private land after years of staying in campgrounds, on roadsides, and rest areas. Both women say it's exhausting. They have to venture further and further from places where people frequent in order to stay healthy. Van life is having a moment in the media and popular culture, and it can sometimes look appealing on social media. But hearing Evangeline and Maggie made me realize how challenging it can be, that it can be very isolating. Their decisions to live in vehicles is something many people in their lives who don't have MCS aren't able or willing to try to understand. And to think there are countless others like Maggie and Evangeline who are courageous enough to keep going, even if it means living a displaced existence, unable to work, further their studies, and socialize with family and friends like they used to. I've been picturing all kinds of people living in vehicles and surviving, mostly invisible to the rest of society. It was very moving hearing Maggie and Evangeline's stories, and I'm really grateful to them for sharing some of their experiences. I hope you enjoy the conversation and find it of benefit. We release new episodes twice a month. The best way to never miss one is to subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way to help others learn about the podcast. And thanks so much for listening. I'm joined today by two guests, Evangeline Elmendorf Greene and Maggie, but Maggie is using a pseudonym. I'm really grateful to both of you for joining me on the podcast. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. It's good to be here.
I'd like to invite Maggie to start if I could. Do you want to introduce yourself, Maggie?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Maggie, and I have had 2 different stints living in a van, and it's been almost 2 years this time, about 3 years total that I've been living in a vehicle to help my environmental illnesses, including multiple chemical sensitivity, which I don't have anymore as a result of living in the van, which has been a great blessing.
So would you say your illness is in remission, for lack of another word? Or is it sort of not currently problematic for you because you're able to avoid triggers?
At first, that's what I was doing, was avoiding triggers. And as long as I avoided those triggers, it was in remission. Or maybe you wouldn't say that's remission. It's just, really good avoidance. Now what seems to be happening, the longer that I'm living in the vehicle and avoiding anything environmental that appears to trigger me, is I seem to be having some healing in terms of my susceptibility to MCS. So I'm now able to use dish soap and do a number of different things that I wouldn't have been able to before with no reaction. So I'm not having to avoid as many triggers as when I first started.
Great to know. And just for our listeners, you're choosing to use a pseudonym do you want to let us know why that's important for you?
Sure. Yeah. I think that people with MCS and environmental illnesses, even though it's becoming more and more well known, um, it's still a very stigmatized experience. And choosing to live in a vehicle to deal with these things, or in some ways being forced to live in a vehicle because of financial concerns plus the constraints of the illness, puts my experience has been that that's been even more stigmatizing on top of the illness for me. And so I used to work, I don't currently work, I used to work in a field as a psychologist. I used to work as a psychologist. And so I'm just wanting to use a pseudonym so that if I choose to go back to work, it's my choice whether or not to disclose about my environmental illness. I'm not quite ready to be outed as a psychologist with environmental illness, even though I think that people being public about their journeys is very, very important.
I really appreciate you sharing that, and I really understand. So thank you so much. And where are you joining the call from today, if I may ask?
Today, I'm in Laramie, Wyoming.
And that's not always where you are, where you stay in your vehicle, but you've moved there to be healthy. And we can talk more a little bit about where you normally are and sort of the routes you choose and the locations that seem to work for you. And Evangeline, would you like to introduce yourself?
So I am not choosing to remain anonymous. I had to give up my teaching career and am now starting my 5th year in a vehicle and actually living in a relative's mini cargo van. As Maggie pointed out, there are a lot of financial constraints. And so now my only income is disability, and unfortunately I couldn't make my truck payment anymore, and the truck was taken away by the bank. So that's how I ended up in a relative's vehicle. And so I snowbird mostly between Arizona in the winter and New Mexico in the summer. But as I'm watching climate change very, very much affect the Southwest, I may be rethinking that.
And a lot of the time you stay in your vehicles in the same state in New Mexico and you know each other.
We do have a mutual friend, and we are aware of each other's journeys and of each other's healing and basically what we're doing to continue to heal. And like Maggie, I also have been able to go more places, go into more buildings. Since I started spending more time in wilderness, I have been less reactive and can go into more buildings, although there are certain types of buildings I do have to avoid.
And so just to note, you haven't met face to face, but you've been in touch,
No, we have not.
right? You've been in touch through the internet and you've known each other for some time. And I imagine you probably share some tips around living in vehicles.
Now that Maggie and I are participating together in your podcast, Erin, that we will likely have even more communication with each other.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I'd like to invite you, Maggie, to talk a little bit about what life was like for you before you got ill with environmental illness, MCS. Where were you living and what were you doing?
Wow, life before I was ill. I, it's a funny question because looking back, now that I know what it feels like in my body when I'm having environmental exposures that are over tolerance, I'm able to look back at just these odd bumps, even in my childhood, that why was that one year, my senior year in high school, I was having problems in English class that I'd never had before in my life. And the English class was in the basement. And now I can look back and recognize that environment was much too moldy for me. And it was impacting my ability to even participate in class. But despite these seeming kind of susceptibilities to environmental toxins, I did manage to hang in there for a long time in life. And I went to college. I graduated. I moved to Washington, D.C. I got the job that I was really hoping to get, the job that would kind of help me towards being a clinical psychologist. I applied to graduate school in clinical psychology. I got in, and that's when I moved to St. Louis, Missouri. And that's when my illness really began. I had had one exposure when I was 20 years old. I had moved into a house that had visible black mold growing. I didn't realize it when I moved in, but black mold started growing on my belongings. And that's the first time I developed anything weird with my health. And I was diagnosed with COPD. Basically, I had bronchitis-like episodes for 9 out of 12 months of the year and needed to be constantly on antibiotics. But after that mold exposure, even though I left and that the lung issues continued, it remained localized to the lungs. And so it wasn't until graduate school in Missouri when I got exposed to the black mold in their buildings, and that I began to develop basically a multi-systemic illness. And I remember being on vacation, going to see my family over the holidays, and starting to wonder. For example, I had started to get headaches. I'd never had those in my life. They were turning into migraines. I was starting to wonder about triggers, starting to wonder about chemicals, just a little bit. And I was describing all of this to my younger cousin, what was going on with my health, and she actually knew about MCS before I did. And not that this is recommended to do to anyone, but she went and she got some chemicals out of a cleaning closet, and she asked permission, and we held them under my nose, and she watched just all these health symptoms pop up. And so she was the first one to suggest that I might have MCS.
Was there a point, Maggie, when you started to consider the possibility of living in a vehicle? Was that something you'd considered over time? How did it come about? Was it a gradual decision or a sudden decision you made where you came to a point where you couldn't live indoors anymore? What was the process like?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was both. It was sudden and gradual, although I would emphasize the sudden part because, I learned about other people living in their cars before I did it, for environmental illness and for multiple chemical sensitivity. And so that's why I say it was gradual. And when I first started doing it, I thought of it as a choice a little bit. And I remember thinking about this group of people and not identifying as one of them, and thinking, I'm not sure I want to be like them. I'm not sure I want to choose this, but it really wasn't a choice. And I ended up in my car because as I progressed through my graduate program and into getting licensed as a clinical psychologist, I continued to be exposed to moldy buildings and environments that were over my tolerance in terms of environmental toxins. In order to get licensed, we have to complete an internship, and we don't quite get to choose where to go. The computer does a matching process. And I got sent to a training program that I was very interested in I was interested in being trained by the people there. But what they hadn't told me before I got there is that OSHA had been, and that there was a lot of environmental toxins. A fourth of their new hires become permanently disabled after working there. Lawsuits have been settled. And so I was teetering on the edge of needing to live in my car before that internship. And that internship is what pushed me over the edge. And I went from that internship to Oregon, where, so after I completed internship, I now had my PhD. That was the final requirement for that, but I was not yet licensed. So we accrue postdoctoral hours to get licensed. And I did that in Oregon. And Portland was full of moldy buildings, and the outdoor air was also full of some type of environmental contaminants that are over tolerance for me. And I remember the first night I lived in my car, I had moved into a new apartment building that at the time didn't seem moldy to me. I'm more able to discern mold now, but it seemed to be okay. I was on the first floor and everyone would smoke outside my window. And my MCS was getting worse and worse in Portland. And I felt like there was just nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. I would have a migraine. I started to not be able to get out of bed. I didn't know how I was going to stay alive in this world that didn't feel made for me. And it was a Friday night and someone was smoking the eighth cigarette outside my door and my symptoms were flaring, and I picked up my dog and I got in the car with no plans and no belongings, and I drove out into the high desert in Oregon because other people like me with environmental illness have gotten relief out there before. And I felt the difference immediately to the outdoor air. I felt hope for the first time.
That is really amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. Evangeline, do you want to take us back to what your life was like before and while you were starting to learn more about the illness that you had?
I began to notice a few little changes in the early 2000s. I started feeling a pressure in the back of my head, a heaviness, and I would stumble over words and sometimes stumble over my feet. And so I went to several doctors and none of them quite understood what was going on. The symptoms seemed to get worse in the spring. So eventually they attributed it to allergies. Now that I look back on it, I think maybe that I already had Lyme disease and that these were symptoms of Lyme disease, but I can't say for sure. So then that was in the early 2000s. That was in New Mexico. So fast forward to Tennessee, where I was getting my master's in theory and practice in teaching English as a second language. And I didn't really have any symptoms beyond those symptoms. But then once I graduated, I moved to Iowa, and I moved in with my fiance and his house. I'm going to say it reminded me of the house of Usher. There was black mold all over some of the walls. There was this smell of mold. But at the time, I didn't understand that mold was dangerous. I had this sort of blase attitude. Oh, let's just roll up our sleeves and start scrubbing with bleach. But I actually missed a part of this, and I'm going to take you back a little bit. So in 2009, I was also in Tennessee, and I had an industrial accident at work. I was working as an interpreter in a pond company, and somebody brought in a damaged diesel generator, and the clerk turned it on inside the building and filled the building with black smoke, and I passed out and hit my head on the counter on the way down. And so then I had to go to the hospital and get a brain scan. And from then on, I started having reactions around chemicals. Every time I got around a very heavy duty chemical, a cleaning supply, something like that, I would feel my eyes roll back in my head and I would have to grip a wall not to go down. And so back to Iowa in 2013, the first symptom that I had in the moldy house was that my joints began to swell up and get very painful. Eventually, my fiance and I moved into a house that I bought. Not knowing anything about the mold issue, we moved all of our belongings into that house, and my symptoms began to increase. Long story short, eventually I had to go to the doctors because I was having a lot of digestive issues. I was having some cognitive issues, and I would have what turned out to be petit mal seizures and bloody noses, especially when I crawled into our bed. And it turns out that the mattress was just infested with mold. I was displaying the symptoms of Parkinson's and still trying to hold down my teaching job. So eventually my doctors sent me to an environmental allergist when the Parkinson's test came back negative. And long story short, I had moved into another house by that time, which was equally moldy, and I lost all my belongings. And I moved into a hotel to finish out the school year. By that time, I could barely even walk, had to inch along a wall to walk. And so moved back to New Mexico, which is my home state, and did hold down another job in a small town for a year, but couldn't find any safe housing. And at the end of that year is when I moved into a vehicle.
And can you talk a little bit about the first night you slept in a vehicle? What was that like for you?
So I camped for about a month or so, maybe 2 months, at a wolf sanctuary campground. And the air was good, and listening to the wolves at night was amazing. But eventually I began to run out of money. I had borrowed money from a friend, and I was still hopeful that I could find a teaching job with some safe housing, and I wasn't able to do that. So eventually a family member, specifically my aunt, brought me into Santa Fe and began to help me out there. But living in an urban area in one's vehicle is way different than camping out in wilderness. And so for about 2 years, I think, I lived in Santa Fe and slept at the rest area most nights outside of Santa Fe while I accessed resources like food stamps and went through the disability application process. And I realized that another winter spent at the rest area was just not feasible. It was too cold and I was getting too depressed. I decided I was going to go to Arizona and just start camping. And I've been lucky in that I have found people with private land who have rented me camping spots. But I don't know how much longer that's going to be feasible. And I'm wondering if soon I will have to become, instead of a snowbird, really become a nomad and start venturing further out. For example, with regard to where Maggie is now, maybe I need to start venturing into Eastern Oregon or Wyoming or further north, depending on what happens with regard to climate change, because I feel like I'm watching the Southwest die with wildfires and not enough water. This summer, I decided that I would rent a room to escape the wildfire smoke. And I was hopeful that I would be able to transition into a building, but that turned out not to be feasible. The room had some water damage and my health started to spiral downward. So now I'm back camping above Santa Fe. And once the weather starts to turn cold, I will have to go back to Arizona.
And be in a vehicle?
Well, I do on some friends' property. I do have a small converted cargo trailer that I stay in down there. It doesn't have any plumbing, but it's much more of a homey hearth feeling than living in a vehicle. So during the winter, now that I've gotten that cargo trailer established, at least for right now, I feel a little more grounded. Unfortunately, the van doesn't have towing capacity for the trailer, so I'm not really sure when and if the trailer has to be moved, which eventually it will, where I'm going to go with it or what I'm going to do.
I'd like to ask you, Maggie, what's been the most positive thing for you about living in a vehicle? I mean, you talked about that it's allowed you to regain your health in some ways, right?
Yeah, the most positive thing is the changes to my health. And along with that, how empowering it feels after, as Evangeline mentioned, seeing so many doctors and struggling with my health for so long, to finally be seeing movement towards health. And just last week, for example, I hiked to the top of a 12,000-foot mountain. And in 2018, just 3 years ago, I couldn't get 6 feet from the couch to the toaster oven to make myself a baked potato.
So you've noticed a lot of improvement.
Yeah. At first, I just felt grateful that I had a way to avoid the triggers. But to have more than that, to be regaining foundational levels of health and have increasing tolerance to chemicals and environmental toxins. It's not that I'm going to go live a life where I'm immersed in those things. I still think that they're not good for people, and I wish that we were treating the environment differently, treating the land differently. But to have the choice to walk down any aisle in the grocery store, to be able to tolerate someone wearing perfume, to get a goal of mine met. I mean, it's hard to really describe how much it means and what it means for my life.
Yeah, that's really significant. There's so much to think about, obviously. And as Maggie noted, there's been some benefits, but there are a whole number of challenges. And you've talked about climate change. And I can imagine you're just that much more exposed to wildfire smoke and the heat. I wanted to invite you to share if there are any other challenges. Maggie, would you be willing to talk a little bit about the greatest challenge that's come for you with living in a vehicle?
Sure. The greatest challenge for me has been heartbreak, struggling with feelings of societal betrayal, and what really feels like an interpersonal trauma to me, that I am, in some sense, an environmental refugee with no hotline to call, no one available, or so few people available. Most of my friends are unwilling to have even casual conversations with me because the honest truth of what's happening to me in my life is too distressing, not acceptable. And so while I've had all these health gains, when I had to move into a vehicle, I cried so hard I was choking on my tears for nights and months. And I've had times when I was suicidal, more often than not, when it gets to that kind of an extreme level of sadness for me or despair, that means I'm in an environment that's over my tolerance. I usually find that no matter how sad I am, when I get away from the environmental triggers, the suicidality goes away. But I have had to read a lot of books. I searched for every book on betrayal and belonging. I read someone's dissertation on, what is it? I forget the name. This is another thing environmental illness has impacted my memory. But I read a book on the impacts of nuclear waste and people who are struggling with that. And the politics of, I remember, yeah, it was something about the politics of invisibility, it was called, and what gets to be declared a problem. And I'm reading Bell Hook's book right now about belonging, and all about our relationship with the earth. So there have been other struggles in terms of being deemed homelessness or, homeless or illegal, lots of problems with the police, problems with the environment, like how last winter I figured out how to survive in 0-degree temps for the first time. And the answer is hot hands, supersized hot hands. But I think the interpersonal layer of this breaks my heart into pieces in ways that the other practical challenges don't. And it has also brought up for me interpersonal trauma from my past. And so it's not just feeling the betrayal of these things happening right now and the fact that I've fallen through the cracks of society, but it's feeling that at the same time as I feel the betrayals of my past and in my childhood. And so I've had to seek out some good trauma therapy for that.
Thank you for sharing. Evangeline, how have your family and friends responded to the situation that you find yourself in?
Well, I lost my husband. He left, as well 4 out of my 5 children. And I think that I want to perhaps echo what Maggie has said, that I feel a constant sadness and a constant feeling of, yes, isolation. I want to pay tribute to my aunt who literally rescued me starving out of the wilderness. And if it hadn't been for her being my biggest cheerleader, and helping me to survive through these years, I don't think I would be here. But at the same time, becoming aware of and connecting with so many other environmental refugees, I feel that this is suddenly something that can be validated, that I'm not alone, that this isn't in my head. I've come to understand that we are indicator species, just like amphibians who are born with extra limbs and fish who are born without gills. It stands to reason that with how the earth is being destroyed in the name of profit and being polluted and poisoned, that eventually humans were going to start becoming indicator species as well. And we are them. But yes, isolation and loneliness is huge because my social life is now online. And the few chances that I get to come into physical contact with people who are important to me, the few chances that I get to be able to hug someone, I can't even begin to describe how it affects my soul to be able to touch someone or to be able to look someone in the eye or to be able to spend time with someone, with people who are understanding or who are experiencing a variation of what I'm experiencing or who are caring and compassionate.
Well, I'm so moved hearing both of you share, and I think our listeners will be really, really moved hearing you. So thank you so much for sharing. Well, we have one question from a listener whose name is, at least online, is Bubbin Jonesy on Instagram. And Bubbin Jonesy writes, I'm super curious how they do this with all the new car smell related chemicals in vehicles. I can barely tolerate being in our now almost 5-year-old, which I thought was supposed to be one of the least toxic brands. So how do you deal with the new car smell that sometimes just doesn't go away?
Sure. Yeah. When I fled Portland, my MCS was at an all-time high, and I was in a leased vehicle that was a year and a half old. I hadn't known that it was going to be such a trigger for me when I leased it, and I couldn't go in it without getting a migraine. And so for that first year, I camped outside the vehicle. And this is obviously not ideal to have to get into a vehicle that gives you pretty bad MCS reactions, but I spent as much time as I could outside the vehicle. I know sometimes people have asked me, well, how do I find a tent that I don't react to? Because they often come with flame retardants. There are some companies that make them without fire retardants. And I do know of one person, and there's a resource, there's a website that speaks about this, who sewed their own tent. They're not a great sewer or anything. It's very, very simple, but they sewed it out of materials that they didn't react to. But new car chemicals and smells was a problem for me for a long time. And so I had to find used cars that I tolerated. As I started doing this, I quickly started healing, is really the answer. And right now I'm in a rental car with 7,000 miles on it that's filled with the new car smell, and it's no longer an issue for me.
Evangeline?
Well, I will say that what I find to be really interesting is that every one of us who has MCS reacts differently to different things. And I really have not had a problem with new car smell. Both the vehicles that I've lived in have been brand new, and I never had a problem with it. There are other things that I've definitely had problems with. For example, the sleeping bag that I always relied on and I knew I could order safely and be able to use it. Suddenly, I stopped being able to tolerate it. So with regard to new car smell, I haven't had a problem with new car smell, but I definitely have had problems with other things that have chemicals. And at one point, when my credit was still good, I even tried to buy a travel trailer, and that was another story in and of itself. The first night that I owned it, the RV company had forgotten to put a plug in the hot water heater and it flooded. So I had to do a voluntary repossession. But in the search for that travel trailer, I had a lot of issues with travel trailers as I went into them to try them out. So definitely I've had some issues, but the new car smell has not been one of them.
Well, another question that comes to mind is mold. And Evangeline, you've talked about mold and the challenges it's caused you. Do you think about mold in vehicles that you live in or consider living in? Is it an issue for you?
It's hugely an issue for me. And last year and this year, I've had to kind of give a treatment to the HVAC system in the van that I'm living in now because the HVAC system went moldy a little bit. Or I'm not going to say moldy, I'm going to say musty. So sometimes I can safely use the HVAC system and sometimes it doesn't feel so great. But definitely, I think mold is more my kryptonite than chemicals as I have continued to progress in my healing. My chemical reactions have gone down, but the mold reactions, really mold is my kryptonite more so.
Understood. I wonder if you happen to have any recommendations for people who may be listening who have MCS and may be considering living in vehicles.
Yeah, what I would share, Aaron, is that there's lots of other people like you out there. There's entire online communities with thousands of people in them, just like the MCS communities that you might be a part of, where people are not just living in their cars, but are doing so because of environmental illness and are healing, experiencing some health benefits. And so the thing that got me started in living in my car, or made me aware that it was an option, made it realistic or possible for me, was first finding those people and learning from their experiences. So I would recommend doing that.
Thank you so much. Evangeline?
Well, definitely, I have friends who have been through the ringer when it comes to trying to choose a vehicle. So I guess my recommendation, and I know this is might even almost sound trite, but just that when you go to look at vehicles, you have to spend some time in them. You have to lift up a carpet and look underneath it. Definitely turn on the HVAC system and sit in the vehicle while the HVAC system is running. I'm going to be very hopeful and optimistic here and say that eventually, if someone is searching for a vehicle to live in, to start out on a healing journey or a sabbatical, that eventually you will find one. It's just, it's a process. And maybe it's not fair for me to really give recommendations because I've only been in new vehicles and I haven't had a problem with them. But I know that there are older vehicles that are problematic because of mold. So it's kind of between a rock and a hard place. You want an older vehicle because it's off gassed, but then there's the mold issue. So I think it's just different for everyone.
Understood. So before we wrap up our chat, I wanted to ask if there's anything else you'd like to share with our listeners.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks for holding this space. I think one thing that might not be represented in the talk today that might just be good to be transparent with our listeners about is social class. I do know people in my community of environmentally ill people who live in vehicles who have much more access to money than Evangeline or I do. And while the money doesn't allow them to escape many of the aspects, the obstacles and struggles that Evangeline have talked about today, I do notice that it has made things slightly different for them. So, for example, they might be able to. I know someone who owns multiple properties in multiple states, and so the likelihood that they are sleeping on public land or sleeping places where it's not legal to sleep is a lot lower. They're able to buy large tracts of land and to keep people away from their acreage. So I think there can be some nuances to this journey depending on your access to money, but certain things like the stigma, certain things will remain the same. But I just wanted to mention that for people who might have more money and might want to pursue this type of healing.
Yeah, no, I hear you on that. There's also the obvious factor that you're both women, right?
Hmm.
And I wanted to perhaps invite you to reflect on if that's something that is part of your thinking and your experience when it comes to being in the wilderness or in remote areas.
I was scared at first. I was an outdoorsy person growing up. I was a whitewater raft guide, but I hadn't done a lot of camping. I'm also a queer person, and I was afraid to even drive out to Eastern Oregon to the high desert as a queer person. I was glad that I'd gotten rid of the car that had identified me as a queer person. I at times have considered wearing a fake wedding ring. What I did to ease my way in is at first I stayed in locations that weren't as good for my health, but made me feel safe until I worked up a sense of comfort with this type of lifestyle. Now I stay in very remote locations. I'm not sure that I'm the best role model. I no longer carry pepper spray on me. I don't have the hunting knife I used to carry. I do have a small 11-pound dog with me, but he would invite anyone in um, that wanted to give him a belly rub. So those fears in the beginning, they were really real. What I found, although things have happened, like a friend of mine the other month had someone, she was sleeping in a public area in her car, and he came up and tried to get in through the back of the hatchback. So I always try to remember anytime the car is stopped, have I pressed the lock button? But for better or worse, I have lost some of that middle class sensibility I used to have. And I kind of now consider the car is the physical barrier. Like, unless you've touched my actual car, I'm not going to move.
And Evangeline, would you like to share anything with the listener?
Yes, I think it's interesting the point that you brought up about the difference between men and women who are on this journey. And I think it would be really interesting if you did a podcast with a few men who live in their vehicles who are pursuing healing from MCS. I will say that at first I was scared. I read the book called Camp Like a Girl by Sarah Riley Matson, and that really helped out. And she sent a personal message to me about sleeping that first night in her vehicle in a hammock across the front of her vehicle out in the middle of the desert. And that gave me so much courage to go out and to be able to do it. And one thing that I did find going out into the wilderness alone was this new passion for nature photography and wilderness photography. But I also have become pretty tough in terms of not being so trusting. I do carry pepper spray. I do carry a very sharp knife, and I would not hesitate to use it if someone attacked me or someone came for me. I spent one winter camping, being almost the only camper in a very remote state park. And it was actually a pretty wonderful experience. So I think there is that fear that can overtake us. But at the same time, I feel stronger, and I want to be able to be someone who stands up not only for myself, but for all of us, that we deserve a place in the world.
That's amazing. Well, having, ventured into some remote state parks, they're pretty spooky at night. So you really have a lot of courage.
There were some times when I would walk to the shower in this state park, and I would be the only camper, and it would be dark, and I would have my flashlight, and I would feel fear, and I would hurry. But eventually I overcame that fear, and I did carry my pepper spray with me. So I think now at this point, I don't venture out of the van after dark, or if I'm in a tent, although mostly I spend camping in my van. I don't do much tent camping because of safety issues.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Makes total sense. Well, thank you so much to both of you, Maggie, Evangeline, for sharing everything you've shared during our chat. And I think it'll be really beneficial for listeners. So thank you so much. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Aaron, for your amazing podcast. I love all your podcast episodes. And thank you, Maggie, for sharing this podcast episode with me.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Aaron, for having us on.
That brings us to the end of this episode of the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. Thank you very much to Maggie and Evangeline for sharing their experiences. The podcast is produced by me, Aaron Goodman, and Danny Penaloza. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts to never miss an episode. Leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It's a great way to help others find the podcast. And follow us on social media. Just search for the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast or Podcasting MCS. If there's someone you'd like to hear interviewed on the podcast or a topic you'd like us to explore, just let me know. Email me at info@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. And thanks so much for listening.